The reason I called you together is because this morning the Senate passed 61 to 39 H.R. 1586. And what I'm focusing on is not necessarily all the $26 billion in the funding, but that $10 billion that involves funding for education, which goes to the states. And the Senate language authored by Doggett dramatically changes the bill. Grants to all other states but Texas have to be spent by the states on job creation and retention in education. And the bill asks that the governor of each state seeking funds, quote unquote, provide an assurance to the Secretary of Education that the state will fund education for fiscal year 2011, not less than the amount of money that was appropriated for fiscal year 2009. Now, if such assurance is made to the Secretary must disperse those funds within 45 days. If the governor doesn't provide such an assurance, then the Secretary of Education can provide for a distribution for these funds to be distributed to other educational entities within the state rather than making a statewide grant. So the 49 of the states, they have to maintain their spending going forward based on 2009. Not so with Texas. In the Doggett language, we have unique conditions on Texas, and only Texas's receipt of funds under this bill. In order for the state of Texas or any educational entity within Texas to receive any funding, the governor of the state of Texas, Rick Perry, must assure the Secretary of Education that Texas will, one, spend at least as much on education in 2011, 12, and 13 as it did in 2011. All the other 49 states spend as much in 2011 as you spend in 2009. Texas spend as much in 2011, 12, and 13 as you spend in 2011. And he added, as a percentage of the state budget. It's not beyond the probability that some of our transportation spending in the 2011 session will go up. Some of our Medicaid spending in 2011 will go up, which will mean under this provision that our education spending has to go up. And two, that the state of Texas has to use the federal spending to supplement education expenditures. So that Texas is the only state that must disperse funds to local educational entities pursuant to federal rather than state funding formulas. In the other 49 states, the state has the option of dispersing the funds on Title I students or according to their state funding formula. Not so for Texas. Now, I know Governor Perry has taken the position that this language is unconstitutional, but it was stricken from previous legislation. Now we've seen the language stay in this bill, and from what I understand, the House is being called back next Tuesday at 10 o'clock to vote on this legislation. This legislation harms school children and schools and teachers. Because speaking as the President of the Senate, as a non-lawyer, this provision is blatantly unconstitutional. And for a former Texas Supreme Court justice, I'm at a loss to understand how Lloyd Doggett could consider it to be anything but unconstitutional. I don't want to think that his whole intent is to hurt school children, but the governor of the state of Texas cannot make assurances that bind future legislatures. Any attempt by the governor here in Texas to bind the legislature's hands would not only be ineffective because he lacks that power, and his mere attempt to do so could violate the separation of powers provision of the Texas Constitution, Article 2, Section 1. And even if the governor of the state of Texas were to attempt to make the required assurance, his empty words would have no binding effect on whether the legislature actually allocated the state's money the way that the dogged language envisions. There are several different federal reasons why this provision is unconstitutional, according to the briefing I just finished with, so I apologize for being a few minutes late, with the Attorney General's office. The Attorney General has advised me that under U.S. Supreme Court law, in the case of South Dakota versus Dole, Congress cannot put a condition on a state's receipt of federal dollars unless the condition relates to the federal interest in the program at issue. And here is public education. But the special condition in Doggett's language puts on Texas would require the governor of the state of Texas to violate the Texas Constitution by attempting to make a promise, a commitment, to bind the Texas legislature, which he or she cannot do. Because Texas cannot legally comply with this condition, it cannot receive any of the funds that are allocated under this bill. And that result is completely opposite to the intent, which I understand, of Congress, which was to provide additional funding for education and jobs, which means that this provision is unconstitutional. Again. The words, this is the second time we've seen the words. The first time, the Secretary of Education personally approved our use of stimulus funds in the 2009 session for fiscal years 2010 and 2011. In the bill, there are the words on page 14, additional requirements for the state of Texas. The following requirements shall apply to the state of Texas. I have no idea at the end of the day, for someone who should know better, why is Congressman Doggett trying to hurt public education and school kids and children? On a $10 billion appropriation by Congress, as you know, here in Texas, Texas contributions to federal tax in total account for roughly a little more than 8%. And the amount of money that Texas was to receive in this bill, $824 million, would have meant keeping over 13,000 teachers. That's a big number. We're talking about 13,000 good teachers. And it would be unconstitutional for the governor of the state of Texas to try and comply with this statute because the legislature will not be in a position for another almost 10 months to have completed its business and certified its budget. The governor of the state of Texas cannot guarantee any level of state funding for any purpose. Again, this is round two. And you ask yourself, if this was such a good deal for Texas, why wasn't it applied to all 49 states? So, no one wants to see cuts in public school education. In the 2009 session, we added $1.92 billion of stimulus funds. We added those to public education. That was additional spending. And my hope is that every member of the Texas delegation will reconsider this ill-conceived bill that adversely affects our schools, our school teachers, and our students, and strip this language out of the bill if the House takes it up next Tuesday.